Hi there, me again. So when I first got back into shooting film photography, I quickly realized that the things I wanted to photograph lent themselves pretty well to the 35mm focal length. And about a year ago, I replaced my Russian Jupiter 12, which is a very budget-friendly 35mm lens, with a different 35mm lens. And that's the lens that currently sits on my Canon P. So today we're going to talk about this lens, the Voigtlander Color-Skopar 35mm f2.5 MC LTM C-Type lens. Wow, that's a mouthful. God, I'm a nerd. So before I talk about the specs of this lens, I'm going to talk a little bit about Voigtlander and when this lens was manufactured and stuff. So if you didn't know, Voigtlander is a German company, and I believe they're the oldest name in camera optics, which is pretty cool. But in 1999, they were bought by Cosina, the Japanese company, and after Cosina bought the company, they came out with a slew of lenses, and some of them were just remakes of old classic lenses, and some of them were more modern lens designs, and that is what this lens is, more modern design. So Cosina Voigtlander made this lens in a few different lens mounts. They made it in LTM, or Leica thread mount, they made it in Leica M-Mount, and they also made it in Nikon S-Mount for the Nikon S rangefinders. In terms of the LTM flavor of this lens, they made two versions. They made the C-Type, which is what I have, and that stands for classic, I believe. And then they made the P-Type lens, which stands for pancake, I think. But that's not really much of a pancake lens in my opinion. The Pancake 2, which was for the M-Mount, really was a pancake lens, and it's a very, very small lens and a very popular start if you are just getting into the M-Mount system. So now let's get into the specs of the Voigtlander Color-Skopar. It has 10 aperture blades, it has 7 elements in 5 groups, it has a minimum focus distance of 0.7 meters, although I think that differs a little bit between lens mounts, but the C-Type LTM version has a 0.7 meter minimum focusing distance. The focus throw is about 90 degrees, and the filter thread is 39 millimeters. So I've had this little lens here for about a year now, and I've taken it with me on quite a few trips, and it's pretty much always mounted to my Canon P. I'd say 90% of the time I have this lens on this camera. I've also mounted it to digital a couple times, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But from my tests and all of the use I've gotten out of it, it is a great lens, and it has some pros and a couple cons, which we'll talk about. First off, this lens is super sharp. I have not had a single complaint about sharpness with this lens. It seems pretty sharp across the frame. No matter what aperture you're at, you can shoot at 2.5, and it's still pretty sharp across the frame, although that depth of field can get kind of shallow, especially once you get into that minimum focusing distance. The second thing I really like about this lens, and the C-Type in particular, is how it looks. I think the silver version of this lens looks amazing on the Canon P. It's actually been my dream to pair this camera with this lens for quite a while, and now that I have this pairing, I'm super happy about it. Also worth noting is this lens comes in silver and black, and I think no matter what camera you're thinking about mounting this lens to, I think the C-Type is the way to go. I think it just looks the best out of all of the different versions of this lens. And even if you have an M-Mount camera, I would still get this lens and just get an LTM to M-Mount adapter. I think you can't go wrong with this design. I really like the size and weight of this lens. This lens honestly fits this camera perfectly, and I think pretty much any rangefinder it would be a perfect fit with. Yeah, I really enjoy the size and weight and shape of this lens. And also, talking about the design a little bit more, I love the little lens hood that it has. It has a nice metal lens hood that matches the body very nicely, and it also has a metal lens cap that will just slide over the lens hood and stays on with friction, which is very nice. It's got the Voigtlander logo on there, and it just looks very premium. The last little thing about the design of this lens that I think is kind of cool and unique is this little focus knob instead of having a focus tab, and I think some people probably could complain about it, but it's really kind of a preference thing, and I really don't mind this little knob. I think it looks very nice and seems to work well for me. The last pro that really stands out to me immediately with this lens is the minimum focus distance. I really like the 0.7 meter minimum focus distance. That's not something that I have with my other LTM lenses, so it's quite a nice benefit. And actually, now that I have this lens, I've actually learned that the Canon P does stay rangefinder coupled almost to 0.7 meters. There's a little bit of a dead spot just at the very end of the focus throw, but I'd be pretty comfortable focusing at 0.7 meters and just calling it good with what the rangefinder's saying with this camera, which is very cool. So there are some cons about this lens. It does vignette a little bit, although it's more of an issue when you mount it to a digital camera. And something about rangefinder lenses and digital sensors don't really pair up all of that well, and you get vignetting a lot easier on digital than on film, which is kind of interesting. I think it's just something about how close the lens sits to the image plane and how sharp of an angle the light's hitting it at. It just makes it more of a problem on digital than film. But when I'm shooting this lens on film, the vignetting's not really that much of an issue, especially when I'm shooting at, I don't know, f5.6, f8. I don't really ever run into it in a way that's distracting. Now, the biggest issue with these lenses is haze. Now, I don't know if this goes for all the different designs of this lens, but the C-Type in particular does suffer from haze, and my particular lens is no exception. This lens does have some pretty heavy haze, and honestly, it hasn't really affected the images that much. I haven't noticed a loss in sharpness. The only time I notice the haze is maybe in a backlit scene or a scene that has like a street lamp or something in it. It'll have kind of a glow around it, but it's really not that big of a deal to me, if I'm being honest. Pretty soon I plan on taking this lens apart and trying to clean out the haze, but for now it's okay. It really hasn't been that much of an issue for me. So if you're worried about that, just know that I haven't really had a problem with it in my use. I have seen online that people talk about the distortion of this lens. It does have a little bit of barrel distortion, but if you're not comparing it side by side with other 35mm lenses, you're really not going to notice it. It's nothing too extreme, and if anything, it just makes objects that are close to the camera in the center of the frame look a little bit more epic. Now, flaring is another thing that I kind of don't like with this lens. It doesn't flare in very many situations, but if you are in a backlit situation where something is kind of just in front of your lens, something very bright, you might get sharp flares, which are okay as long as they're not on top of your subject. They can definitely be pretty distracting, and yeah, it's not my favorite part about this lens. The last little gripe I have with this lens is the aperture ring. The aperture ring is clicked in half stops, and that's fine, but I think it's honestly a little bit too easy to click. It's not too bad, but the only problem is when you go to turn the focusing knob, you can also accidentally move the aperture ring, and that can really mess up your shots if you're trying to get something off really quickly. And yeah, it's just a little gripe. It's probably only happened to me once or twice in a year of using it, so I really can't say it's that much of an issue, but it is something I should mention to you. So in terms of availability, I don't really know how many of these lenses they manufactured, but I do know they made this lens from March of 1999 to May of 2003, so it was like a 4-year production run. And the only copies I usually ever run into are from Japan, so I don't know if they ever even sold them in the States, but whenever you come across one, they're usually around the $250 to $350 mark, and honestly, for the performance I've been getting out of this lens, I think that is totally worth it. I think if you're looking for a good 35mm lens for your rangefinder camera, you can't go wrong with this lens. So yeah, look no further, I guess. So I think that's about it for my rambling on this Voigtlander Color-Skopar lens. All I can say is I've taken some of my favorite photos to date on this lens, and it may have a couple of little quirks, but it is totally worth the price of admission. I think that's all for now. I'll leave you guys with some of the photos that I've taken with this camera and lens combo, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye now.